This speaker brings over 10 years of experience with Scrum Master and as a Scrum Master and Agile coach, holding positions at USAA, Army National Guard, and Circe Dynex. And they are currently at Improving, one of our sponsors, and also the founder and principal coach at Foundations First Coaching, which specializes in Clifton Strengths Assessment. Welcome, Josh Fryer.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, so for those of you who are online, please, we are going to be using a sheet of paper. For those of you, so grab a sheet of paper. For those of you who are here in the room, there is paper kind of scattered about. If you need a pen, raise your hand. I know Blake here's got helping me out, got some pens here. So we're going to start, before I get into the topic at all, we're going to start with this blank sheet of paper. Okay, we're going to talk about a little bit about note taking, and we're going to move horizontal. Okay, and we're going to have you draw 2 lines down from top to bottom to create 3 columns. Okay. Give everybody a moment to do that. As we get those lines on that page, we're going to have 3 columns. They don't have to be the same size. They can be different sizes. We're not worried about exact measurements here. In the column that is the most narrow, I'd like you to write things he said at the top of it, right? Because everybody always wants to take notes of what the speaker says, but we're putting it in the most narrow column because what I say is probably the least important thing that happens in this room. Okay. So we've got a space for that. Great, that's out of the way. And the largest column, I'd like you to write things that I learned. Okay. So I'm going to talk about my story today. I'm going to tell you about things that I learned through my story, and I'm going to share some of those lessons learned. But as you apply that to your context, I hope that you're able to take your own learnings away from that. And then in that last column, I'd like you to write things I'll do, right? Things that I'm going to do. We really want to make sure that as we embrace that growth mindset, it's not just about coming and listening to someone talk. It's not just about getting a new idea, but actually then applying that idea. And then if we have people coming in late, maybe help them get set up, right? We got the paper still scattered around, help them get their sheet set up as well. So, all right. So with that, a little bit about me. I'm Josh Fryer. I've, as Rachel said, spent 10 years in the Agile space. Before that, I spent time in the Army National Guard as a linguist and an analyst. That time in the military has really helped me understand cultures and communication. Words really do matter, right? Being able to communicate effectively is quite important. And that really then helped set me up for success in the Agile space, where I've been at different places over the last 10 years. And as I've worked on my own skills, I've really found a love for professional coaching, and specifically around strengths coaching. So I got certified as a strengths coach several years ago, and that's going to kind of permeate my story today as well. So where my talents come into play. So a little more that you should know about me. Here are my top 5 talents from the Clifton Strengths Assessment. Learner, futuristic, connectedness, individualization, and belief. In a nutshell, that means that I like to look ahead into the future, see what's on the horizon, make some educated guesses about how that's going to affect the organization and the leaders that I'm working with, and then start preparing before the wave hits. That comes into play a lot with my story, right? So here we go. We're going into story time. It's a tale of 2 layoffs. So our story is going to go back a few years. I was working at USAA. I worked there for 5 different years. No one works in the same place for multiple years, right? Same year, multiple times. Anyway, so I worked there for 5 years in 4 different departments. So USAA, large place. And in the last department that I was working in, I was doing more leadership coaching and working on how do we create an environment where agility can thrive. And one of the things that I noticed as our coaching team was working with different leaders in this area is that there was actually a lot of fear from leaders. The team members were really saying, we need help with these things. And they're sending those calls up the chain. And it just keeps going up the chain and up the chain and up the chain. And none of the leaders felt like they had the authority or the power to actually make a change or make a decision. Right? Even though we had access to even the CIO for that area, she was still hesitant to make changes. And so that made me start to wonder a little bit what was going on. I started warming up my network, right? I was not excited about the work that was going on, and our team wasn't going to be able to be effective if leaders weren't willing to take action, which made me a little hesitant. So that's an element of kind of my futuristic looking ahead. Where was that going? Connecting that into my situation. Now, a few months later, kind of realized what was going on with that fear. The CEO brought in an executive CIO, right? So we had multiple CIOs across the company in different lines of business. And that executive CIO came in to get all the CIOs in line. And so I started doing some research once this executive was named, and there were some yellow flags going on for me. She was coming over from another financial institution where she had come in to help turn around their situation. They were in some dire straits. She came in, got them all sorted and stabilized, and now she was moving on to USAA. So a little bit of concern. And I was wondering, what is going on here, right? What's really at play? And so this is where we're going to go to the books. So I have this awesome book that I wrote. Just kidding. It's not me. So there's this book called The First 90 Days by Michael D. Watkins. And in this book, he talks about the business context. So as a leader, you know, the premise is, as a leader, you're coming into a new place. You've got 90 days to show that you can be effective. And he talks about 4 different business situations. So as you look at these coming in, you're going to behave differently as a leader. So are you coming in for a startup, a turnaround, realignment, or sustaining success? So as I'm looking at this executive CIO coming in, right, I'm starting to realize she's probably no laser pointer. Got it. She's probably coming in for, at best, a realignment, right? Because that was kind of what her mandate was, but potentially a turnaround, right? And so that makes me a little uneasy too. What's happening? What's the business context that's happening here? So I was very keen to hear, what is it that she starts talking about as she introduces herself, as she talks about her mandate, as she starts working through what projects she's interested in, what happens with leadership, things like that, right? So understanding what are the first moves, what are her opening moves, so that I can understand where she's at in this context. So when we're in that realignment phase, right, they're usually coming in with a new strategy, or they're solidifying a strategy. And so when you're in that realignment stage, you want to make sure that whatever work you're doing is aligning to that strategy, right? You can tie it to it somehow, no matter how loosely, right? You're like, no, we're strategic. See how we're connected, right? In a turnaround, you want to be in that core strategy, right? Like this is our core. This is what we do. We also do some other things. Yeah, that gets risky, right? In a turnaround. So again, looking at my situation, where's this agile coaching team? What are we doing? How is what we're doing aligning to the strategy, or is it aligned? And from that realignment space, I wasn't so sure that our CIO was going to, that her strategy was really going to kind of win out in that alignment space. So again, my futuristic, my connectedness, you know, little flags going off. I was like, it's time to warm up my network, right? Am I looking for a job yet? No, but I'm going to start reaching out and saying hi to people I maybe haven't said hi to for a while, right? I started looking at job postings. What's available in the area, right? What kind of certifications are hot in the market right now, and do I have any of those? right? Do I need to be reskilling? So these are some of those things that that I leave on a lot of the time, but was actually paying more attention to as we get through this. So as we went into there, was hearing more and more that things were not aligning. She didn't necessarily like the approach that our coaching team was taking. She had the answer and she said, do it this way. We were like, not sure that I love that. And so that's when I started actively looking for another job. And part of the reason that I did that is because the best time, this is Josh's personal belief, but the best time to look for a job is when you already have a job, right? So that's one of my beliefs, right? Going back to my my top 5 talents. And so I ended up lining up 2 opportunities. Felt like I was in a good spot. I made a decision, picked another company, made the announcement to my team that I was going to be leaving. You know, it's a little bittersweet because I liked working with my team, but I wasn't sure about the longevity there. I'm at my new employer now, day 2 of orientation, and I got a text message from my my former boss, said, "We just got canned." Right. So again, that learner and that futuristic, looking to the horizon, understanding what the business context was, kind of gave me a little bit of a clue, like something's going to happen. And I was able to position myself and make a move before I was directly impacted by it. Now, obviously, that worked out really well for me. And I was then able to also support my former colleagues as they were looking for something new. So that was rewarding for me as well. So I made that decision, started at a new place, dodged a bullet, right? And I'm at a new place. I've got a new team. It's a really cool learning opportunity, experienced coaches. 6 weeks after I started, the CIO said, "I'm out, here's my replacement." And I was like, uh-oh, I've seen this story. So what's going to happen, right? Now, the difference is, what's the business context, right? So that was the question. And that former CEO, the outgoing CIO, was brought in 8 years prior into a turnaround situation, right? So he'd been there for a long time. As a CIO, 8 years is a pretty long time. But he was making those changes. He was making big changes. They were investing in agility, and they were seeing results. You know, the 6 years prior to COVID, they made a lot of changes, and without knowing it, they were ready for COVID, right? So this is Fortune 100 retail. Retail space. So to COVID, they're able to make moves ahead of their competitors, and they really came out on top, right? And so, so from a turnaround perspective to now he's in sustained success, he's ready to retire and pass that baton to a new CIO, right? So business context, sustaining success, pretty good, right? The strategy was agility. I'm on the agile coaching team. Feels pretty good, right? But business context changes, right? A few months later, our VP left. When our VP left, it broke kind of the chain of communication between our team and the new CIO. So without communication, we were adrift. We're told business as usual, right? It's that sustaining success strategy. We're going to do what works. And we were happy. We liked the routines we were in. We continued teaching the classes we were teaching. We continued running the boot camps and working with teams, et cetera. As we went through kind of the rest of that year, beginning of the year, right? Retail, we get the end of the year is a big time, right? Beginning of the year, we get some of those earnings calls and financial conversations. And you know what? Our earnings were softer than expected. Right? And then when the CIO comes on and says, "We are not considering layoffs," like that was a flag, right? Like, okay, right? Like, I mean, the rumor's been going around anyway, right? But like, we're not considering it. Like, okay, right? And so that was my clue again that we're no longer in sustaining success. There's enough fear here that he felt like he needed to address it as well. And we're probably looking at best at a realignment space or potentially turn around. Okay. So it's been 5 or 6 months at this point. We still don't have a VP. Position hasn't even been posted. There's very little communication between us and the CIO. And we finally get a new VP, right? They're restructuring the organization, which is always fun. And we landed ourselves a new VP who has never worked with an Agile coach before. And now she has a whole team of Agile coaches. So she starts asking us questions about what it is that we do and how we contribute to Target and what teams are we working with and that kind of thing, right? So again, some other little alarm bells going off in my head. And then about, another 6 weeks or so after she gets hired, or not hired, but we get realigned underneath her. Due to the next quarterly earnings call with, again, softer than expected revenues. We had a lot of organized retail crime. I heard all about that because that's the space I was in. I don't know if you guys heard about that, but so organized retail crime was a thing that was hurting our bottom line. And then there were some very public mistakes made by leaders that really hurt the brand. And within the matter of a week, $13 billion disappeared off of their market value, right? So if we weren't in a turnaround situation before, we were getting pretty close to it now, because $13 billion is a lot of market valuation to lose. And so I was watching that pretty closely, right? Not just because, I've got money invested in the 401k and things like that, but because if we don't bounce back from that quickly, our business context is changing again, right? So again, I kind of started checking in on my network. I've been here for about a year at this point, right? So a little bit of whiplash for me, but I'm seeing some of the same flags. So, 4 months after we were getting questioned by the VP about what it is that we do, how do we contribute to the bottom line, how does she measure our value, how are we measuring our value, et cetera, right? This happened 6 weeks later, so another, 3 months or so after that. On my day off, I get a text message from my VP asking if I can join a meeting that she just scheduled 20 minutes ago, but it's a mandatory team meeting, right? So again, all those alarm bells that I had going off, I was like, well, I'm on PTO. I don't have to go to this meeting. But also, I'm pretty sure I know what this is, right? And so I went. And it doesn't matter how much you're anticipating getting punched in the gut. But when you do get punched in the gut, it hurts, right? But one of the things for me that was even harder was seeing the shock and dismay on the faces of my teammates, because they had no idea it was coming. I hadn't told anybody. I didn't want to be a fear monger. I didn't want to be Chicken Little running around saying the sky is falling, right? But I had an inkling that something was happening. It came sooner than I expected. I didn't have all my pieces put in order, right? But I was watching for it, and I didn't clue anybody in. And so that's part of the genesis of this, right? What were some of those red flags? How can we talk about that? Because it wasn't just me that was affected, right? We've seen a lot of that over the last year, right? A lot of layoffs in our industry. So I wanted to share some of those red flags. So that's the story portion of it, right? So in summary, we've got a couple of things here for you to consider, right, from those flags. What are your changing business contexts, right? That first 90 days, again, it's just a chapter in that whole book that talks about it, about those business contexts. The other big flag for me was the change in communication, right? Specifically that it decreased. Okay? And then understanding what the business context is. It can be really easy as Agilists to focus on what's happening with our team, what's happening with our program, what's the process. But we really need to make sure that we're connecting to what's happening in the business. It's not just like agility itself is not the goal, right? Agility is a means to achieve a business goal. So understanding what those business goals are and where they're at is also important. But that's just half the battle, right? Is understanding where these flags might be. The other part is about how do we get ready for it. Sergeant First Class Williamson was my recruiter as I was getting into the military. And one of the things, he said a lot of stuff at me, and I don't remember much of it, but as is often the case in the military. But one of the things he said that did stick with me was, if you don't have to stand, then sit. And if you don't have to sit, then lay down and take a nap, right? Because the Army will either keep you really busy or you'll be really bored, but usually it doesn't go back and forth, right? So if you got a chance to sit down, then take that break, right? So while I was in training, we were doing some field training, and I was assigned to the Quick Reaction Force, or the QRF, which essentially means we're on our secure base, and there are squads that are going out to conduct missions. And something's going to go wrong because it's a training environment, and so it always has to go wrong because you learn more when things go wrong than when they go perfectly. And that means they're going to call the Quick Reaction Force. So we're on call, and we got to get moving. Okay. So I'm sitting down, waiting for the call, and I doze off. Right. Wasn't asleep for very long because it's training, and drill sergeants don't let you sleep ever. But I did doze off. And a few moments later, right, I kind of wake up, and I've got a drill sergeant staring right at me, right, with a look that I can only describe as trying to drill holes in my skull with his eyes, right? Like that's the intensity that you can imagine from a drill sergeant. And everybody else is silent, right? They're like, oh, like it's gonna go down. He's gonna be made an example, right? So what do? Boom, I have to parade rest, right? Like I know I'm about to get reamed here. So drill sergeant, right? Like, oh, what do you think this is? Nap time, right? You're the Quick Reaction Force. You can't be bumbling around like a toddler looking for their shoes, right? Using a lot more colorful language. When the call comes, like that's how people die, because you decided it was nap time and you wanted to catch some shut-eye, right? And so then he starts lashing into me, right? He's like, let me see your magazines, right? So I pull out my magazines, and he's checking, are they loaded, right? And are they fully loaded? Cool. Magazines, check, right? Grenades, yeah, got 2 frags, got 1 smoke, got one flashbang. Cool. First aid kit, right? Checks the first aid kit. Yep, I got my first aid kit. And it's stocked. You got water, right? Got my canteens, got my Camelback, right? Starts quizzing me about what the mission sets are for the day, things like that, right? Like, okay, I've got answers for these things. And he's like, all right. Runs out of things to quiz me on. So again, kind of dodged a bullet. Maybe I should have put another slide up there again. But dodged a bullet on that. And he tells me to like sit down and go back to sleep. And then he starts taking it out on everybody else, right? Because he couldn't find something wrong with me. So then he starts lashing into everybody else. So that was kind of fun for me. But he specifically said, go back to sleep, right? And I was like, Roger, just aren't, right? Now why do I tell the story, right? It's the preparation that comes, right? Because when it's the QRF, if you get that call and you got to go find your shoes and you're bumbling around like a toddler, like bad things happen, right? I think that in our industry, we're getting to a point where it's not a matter of if a layoff is going to happen, but when is it going to happen, right? When is it time to move to the next thing? And we've seen a lot of that on LinkedIn and things in the industry. And so for me, there's an element of how are we getting prepared? Can you prepare for everything? No. But there are a couple of things that you can do to lessen that impact, right? So that when you get punched in the gut, it doesn't hurt maybe as bad. So some other context about me. I am the sole income earner in my family. When my wife and I got married, she told me, or as we were courting, she said, I want to be a stay-at-home mom, right? And I was like, okay, well, that's going to take some extra planning, right? We got to figure that out. And now we've got 7 kids, right? There's 5 of them pictured there. We've got another 14 grown goats. We've got 40 chickens, right? 17 chicks, 4 barn cats, 3 pet dogs, 2 mini cows, and a horse itching to go for a ride. There you go. There's my really bad singing, right? So that keeps us pretty busy, right? And keeps her pretty busy. And she's also got 6 kids that she takes care of too, right? Ages 10, 7, 5, 2, and then twin 1-year-olds. So that was taken last week for their first birthday. So, International Women's Day tomorrow, like my wife is rocking that. So she's taking care of a lot. But that's a lot of pressure, right? For me as the sole income earner. And again, that learner, right? What's happening in my industry, the futuristic, seeing what's coming up next, connecting that to my context. And what are some of my beliefs? My beliefs are that I want my wife to be able to do what she wants to do. And that's being with our kids, right? She homeschools the ones that are old enough to go to school, right? And she takes care of our homestead by and large, right? And so that's something that rests with me. In order to be able to support that, there are things that we have to do and things that we've had to simplify. Because ultimately, we don't want to be doomsday preppers, right? Like you take it too far, you can end up over here and then you can be on National Geographic. Or, right, you can not be prepared and just be stressed out about it all the time. So it's about finding that balance. So some of the things that I talk about maybe aren't going to be the perfect thing, right? But again, looking at those columns on your page, right, it's not about what I say, it's about what you're learning, right? So hopefully you can learn some things and your balance will probably look different than mine because your situation is different, okay? But for me, going back to my belief talent, one of the things that I believe in is freedom, right, and independence. And specifically, and so I've made a lot of moves in my life to try and become independent. And that includes from my employer, right? I don't want to be reliant or overly dependent on my employer. And that takes a lot of work. One of the things that I'll put out there is, I think Bob mentioned a version of this as well, but simplicity, right? The amount of stuff not bought is essential, right? So I like to think that credit is cheap. It's pretty easy to get credit nowadays, right? Why? Because they make a lot of money off of giving you credit, right? And so we work really hard to save and to budget and to understand what our expenses are and have an idea of where we are at. There's a lot of literacy that I think is missing around that. So I hope that, you can all that you are literate, or if you're not, like there is an element of literacy that is quite important when you get that notice that you're getting laid off, right? Take stock of what your debt is, right? In general, people know like, oh yeah, I've got my mortgage or I have my monthly rent. I might have some student debt, maybe some medical bills, right? And some of those things, like that's part of living, that's part of adulting, whether we like it or not. But there are other things like, car payments and the ATV or the RV or the boat or the vacation that I put on the credit card, right? Things like that. And I'm not saying that those things are bad, but I'm saying that there is an element of what is the balance and what is the cost to doing those things now. On the growth side of things, right? So growth is one of my core values. So I was tickled to be here at this conference where the whole focus is being, that growth mindset. And so I want to share a little bit about things that I've done to continue to grow, right? For me, excellence, right? Growth and excellence are some of those values. And so I strive to continually grow. I was really excited to move to that new team because it was a team of seasoned coaches and I got to be one of the dumbest people in the room, right? Which means I get to learn a lot, right? And really soak that up. It accelerated my growth, right? It's putting me in the greenhouse and I get to just sprout and bloom. So understanding where you're at and how you can find those opportunities. I mentioned a little bit earlier about how I keep my LinkedIn, job alerts active, right? Why is that? Not because I'm looking for a new job, but because I want to know what certifications are in demand in the market, right? What experiences are companies looking for, right? So if I can look at a job description and I'm like, I've got 80% of those, 90% of those, like on my resume, and I can connect to that, like feeling pretty good. But if things start shifting and I'm only looking at 40%, maybe I need to shift. Maybe I need to look at reskilling, right? I don't want to fall behind. So again, that's my learner and my futuristic. Keeping an eye, keeping a pulse on what's going on. Added benefit is that when I have friends who are looking for a new job, like, oh, I just saw something the other day, right? And I can kind of connect them to postings that look cool or something like that. Which brings into the picture community, right? I'm going to mention community because, I have a talent of connectedness, right? So I like being connected to people, connected to different communities. Bob mentioned his community, the Agile Moose. That's actually where I found one of my roles, was through that community. And actually, of my current positions, 3 of my last 3 positions, they were all found because of connections I'd made through different Agile communities, right? Whether they were internal, right? So USAA, I moved around a lot of times internally, and that was through connections I made at the internal network, right? Or they can be public ones, right? So there's the Agile Moose, Tandem Coaching has one that I've been involved in. There's one that I'm no longer active in, but it's Hands-on Agile by Stephen Wolpers. That's was a really great community. I was simplifying my life, and so I left that one, but I imagine that's still going pretty strong. I see him still continuing to put out new content. Anyway, I'm getting off track. So, so find that community. Find the one that works for you. How many of you have been in an open space before? Small handful. Okay. So in an open space conference, they have a couple of rules, right? And one of those they call the law of 2 feet. Or I saw someone put in a virtual, the law of 5 clicks or something like that, right? Like, so the premise is you're kind of at a conference and there's lots of topics happening at the same time. You don't know what's happening until you get there and you walk into a session. You don't really know what it's about. You've got a title. And the law of 2 feet states, if you are not contributing nor receiving value, then use your feet and go somewhere where you can, right? I've applied that as I try to simplify my life, right? And how many communities I'm involved in and things like that. I think about that with community, right? So find the community that works for you, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be an Agile community, right? We get a lot of, there's facilitator communities, there's trainer communities, there's coaching communities, right? That are focused specifically on those things. But you can take a look at those as well. The last thing that I'm going to mention is doing your homework, right? Understanding and curating who are the voices that you're listening to in the community. Are they reliable? Are they seasoned? Or are they just hopping on a bandwagon, right? And as you look at that, right, there's a lot of blog posts out there, there's a lot of videos, there's a lot of infographics. Great, those are fantastic starters, right? But as we get into those starters, how can you take that a bit further, right? How do we get into the books? How do we then start applying that, right? Coming to conferences, going to training classes, like those are the obvious answers for growth, right? But how are you then taking what you've learned and, like the last column on the sheet of paper there, what is something you're going to do with that new information, right? How am I going to apply that? I've also found success in getting more funding to go learn something new, right, from an employer when I can show them that, hey, I know you sent me last year to this thing, or I know you sent me to 2 things last year, but here's what I brought back and here's what we've changed because I went to that. I'd like to go to this thing and solve this problem for us, right? This is where I'm going to get the information so we can solve it faster. So again, bringing that business case, understanding what the business context is, what the organizational problems are, and being able to sell that business case. So quick summary here, right? For me, how do you increase that freedom, right? That financial freedom, and how do you target your growth areas? So we started by identifying some flags. We've talked about some things that you can do to prepare, but kind of throughout the talk, I've mentioned how I've navigated this because of my talents. So my question for you is, what are your talents? Right? And how are they going to help you? Right? How do you actively employ your talents in the work that you're doing, in the preparations that you're making, in the stability that you're creating in your own life? And I promise you that if you take the time to think about it, to discover what those are, that it's going to pay dividends, right? As you are able to then more fully connect with that. It brings a power into your life and if you do it with your team, right? The lives of teams as they then come together. So I would recommend understanding what are those talents. Okay. And now here we are at the exam, right? I told you at the beginning there was going to be a test, right? So we've got your sheet of paper. You've got the 3 columns. I'd like you to take a minute or so and take a look at that column that says, these are the things that I learned, okay? And either jot something down in there if you haven't been doing that along the way, or, and then, right, I should say, if you've already got those there, what are the things you're going to do? So take a minute and think about, what are the things I'm going to do after this? Contemplative looks, see some pens going. Let's try and get 3 things that you could do. 3 things I could do. All right, and then I'm going to look for a couple of volunteers who'd be willing to share. So anybody like to share something that they could do? Figure out. For the top 5, I've used the Clifton Strengths Assessment. Yeah. So, all right. Thank you for going first and being willing to do that. That can be, it can take courage to do so. So I want to connect you with Blake here at the improving booth afterwards, and he's going to hook you up with either a book or a shirt. All right. So, all right. Anybody else want to share? We got maybe a couple people.
Similar, I'm registered as but we talked about, I have not yet done sort of a what if scenario. and so that's when I take away.
Cool.
Or to summarize, it's look alive, because if the drill sergeant caught me.
My resume, not in a second.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an element like my resume is not ready, right? One of the habits I got into, right? Hey, PI planning, that day after PI planning, I'm wiped, right? So what am I gonna do? Like I'm gonna dust off my resume, right? What did I do new this last quarter, right? Like that's my personal retrospective time. And so it builds into my routine of getting things, keeping things current, right? So,
I've got one more.
all right, yeah, perfect.
So
Thank
this
you,
is
Rachel.
coming from Ken. Ken wants to work on building culture and developing relationships. And Elwood says refresh resume.
Wow. Yeah, having that current, right? Again, the best time to find a new job is when you have a job, and being able to just say, oh yeah, here's my resume is nice. All right, last one. Yeah, and there's always like going back, right? There's a decision point, and just because you've found something that you could pursue doesn't mean you have to pursue it, right? You can be comfortable where you're at, and you can still develop a relationship, right? Rachel mentioned at the beginning, right? Like I'm working with Improving now. I started with them on Monday, right? We started flirting about 5 years ago, right? And things just, didn't line up. They were a little more serious than I was, right? Like it just, and there we go. We finally made it happen. So I want to get to, we'll kind of open up for Q&A in the last few minutes. So Rachel, do we have any questions online that have kind of come in?
No questions
Not yet?
but I'll let
Okay.
you know.
So those of you online, type quick.
Oh,
So we'll go here and then we'll go online. Oh yeah, there's a whole story about cats because I am not a cat person. So I say that having a homestead was the most expensive, like that. Those are the most expensive cats because they weren't going to happen without a homestead.
The question I wanted to ask you was something that's come up a lot in talks with Booster, which is a lot of stuff we're seeing these days says a shrinking market for agile coaches with that skill set being blended into other roles, like a scrum master who's got a strong coaching ability. Granted, scrum master is supposed to have some coaching ability, but we all know that is not necessarily a priority for most hiring. That or dead manager or somebody with the added on ability to help others do the thing. Where would you say that fits in, since the coaching stuff is probably very relevant for a lot of people in the room, is my guess, but also that transition, because this is a fear a lot of people have. I'm in the coaching space, and the demand for that is at least perceived to be.
Yeah, I know from my own perspective, right? I've looked at what would it take for me to get a management position, right? Because agility, like having an agile coach, having that role is something that should be able to be assumed by the organization at some point, right? Which puts us in that precarious position. But do I also have the skills necessary to then move into one of those positions, right? And continue coaching with a different title, right? And it's maybe not the thing I'm doing full time, but it's something that I'm doing at least part time. It's a skill that I'm able to bring, right? Rather than a job that I do. Had one online.
All right. Question from one of our virtual attendees. Elizabeth is asking, as someone who has been part of 3 layoffs in 2 years, how have you maintained your mental health?
Having the homestead has helped a lot of time outside. But again, I'll say community, right? And I don't just mean the agile community, right? Homesteading, it has its own community around it. I'm religious as well, so I have my religious community. My wife is very supportive of the work that I do and where I'm at. And then again, just having that preparation, right? Having that layoff, looking at our finances, we knew what our monthly expenses were. We knew what we had in the bank, and we knew what we had invested that we could potentially liquidate. And we were like, we've got enough buffer that we don't need to worry for this many months, right? And then because, again, like going back to that community aspect of it, I wasn't worried about it because I've been able to curate really good relationships, right? And my last several roles have come because of the relationships I've built in the community. So being able to reduce the preparation has helped me reduce the worry. It doesn't mean that I didn't have bad days, that I didn't feel worthless at times, right? Getting punched in the gut sucks. But it's something to not go through alone. I guess I would say that. So I think we are at time. So I would say we do have a Slack community. So if you have questions, whether online or here in the room, that community is going to be around for a while. So feel free to jot those questions down in there. I know a lot of these slides won't be specifically helpful because it's just a picture, but I do have some of those slides with content on them, and I will put those into the Slack channel as well. So feel free to drop those questions in. I'll keep an eye on that for the next at least couple weeks, and would love to hear some of your implementation stories as well, right? You've got that list of things I'll do. Would love to hear back some of those. And we've got surveys, so please fill out the survey. And I don't know, Rachel, is there any other housekeeping that I'm supposed to mention here? I mentioned the survey, right? So we got the QR codes, so please take the survey. That helps me. It also helps Agile Austin. Then when you come back next year, it helps you, right? So a little bit of delayed gratification, but please do complete the survey. Anything else? All right. Thank you, everybody.